Okay, everybody, we've given the stragglers an extra minute to log on, so I'd like to get started here. Again, David Bain with AACC, serve as the Senior Vice President for Government Relations, and I'm joined here by my two colleagues, Jim Hermes, our Associate Vice President for Government Relations, and Catherine Gimboris, our government relations manager. As you can see from this title slide, table of contents, we have quite a few issues that we're going to walk through this afternoon to give you the latest news about what's going on in Washington and how it might affect your campus and your students. So to start things off, I'm going to just talk a little bit about President Trump's budget for fiscal year 2027, which starts on October 1. The budget was quite a bit late. It was supposed to be out the first week in February and was released, as the slide says, on April 3rd. It follows a lot of the same themes and even more specific policies of the President Trump's first budget, which, as often is the case with a new president, is more of a skeletal budget. But as this slide outlines, the budget didn't have as much detail as it normally contains, nor did it have the out-year predictions and forecasts that the budget has. Defense budget, many of you will know, received a historic proposed increase and concomitantly a substantial decrease in domestic discretionary spending. And those numbers have a relationship to each other to the extent that Congress operates in a functional way with one large pot of money for annually appropriated domestic discretionary programs as they're defined and defense programs. And together those comprise a little bit, just a hair over 30% of the budget, and the rest are the mandatory programs like Social Security and so on, and interest on the debt. So that's a little bit of the broad outlines of President Trump's budget. In terms more specifically about community colleges, the budget here in terms of education, the first thing to note is that the Department of Education does continue to receive funding despite the dismantling, quote unquote, of the department, which continues through other means. But as I think many of you would know, the department can't actually be eliminated without a change in the statute, which would require the cooperation of Senate Democrats, among other things. And so that's not been thought to be a realistic proposal. However, there has been a widespread transfer of administrative function to other agencies, primarily Department of Labor, but not exclusively. Excuse me 1 minute. As the second bullet outlines, the Perkins Act, the proposed funding was moved over to the Department of Labor. Again, the administration, as last year, has proposed an elimination of the Adult Education Act. But one thing we did want to point out to you is that tucked into the budget is a proposal to move all of the Carl Perkins funding to secondary institutions, as opposed to it being divided to not equally, but going to both post-secondary and secondary institutions. We worry about a lot of things here. We're a little less worried about the possibility of that being enacted than we might some other things. The administration proposed that last year as well. It never got any traction as a proposal, and we don't expect that it will this year either. I'm mentioning this particularly because there's been some press coverage that has led people to believe that this proposal might have some legs to it, but in reality, that doesn't seem to be the case. Also, though, of note, and this is a little bit different from last year's budget, but not entirely. The administration is proposing to wipe out funding, eliminate funding for a broad range of non-student financial assistance programs. That includes the ones that are mentioned on this slide. Also, those programs administratively are being moved over to the Department of Labor. That's independent of the budget, but that is a executive branch, discretionary activity that they have undertaken. And so those programs are now being administered in labor. And I'm just going to take a minute in the context of the budget proposal to just mention that one of the things that we've been very deeply engaged here in DC is the looming prospect of the institutional aid programs, classified as minority serving institutions programs. Uh, the largest one is this Hispanic Serving Institutions program, but there's the predominantly Black institution program, the AACC program, and three other programs that combined to a total $330 million or did last year. And those programs received an appropriation for the current fiscal year 2026. The eligibility process for institutions has been announced. And in fact, the deadline for that for applying has elapsed at this point. And we're waiting and watching very closely, reaching out to people both on the Hill and in the administration to let them know that our members are very invested in whatever decision is made in this regard, and that our expectation, along with our hope, is that the entire block of money, the 330 million I mentioned, plus the funding for the Strengthening Institutions program, will be available on a competitive basis to institutions in very short order, because the funds have to be obligated by September 30th, and of course, institutions need a chance to develop applications. We do expect that this is what will transpire. It's certainly no guarantee. It is what we expect. We also expect that institutions will have 30 days to develop applications. So stay tuned, be ready to respond if you're interested in securing those monies. And then also finally, just on the budget in terms of the movement of programs out of the Department of Education, even though the administration has proposed a zeroing out of the C Campus program like they did last year. There is an ongoing competition for that program that's being administered by the Department of Health and Human Services, and I'm sure many of you who have gotten those grants or are interested in competing with them for them know that. So moving on to the Pell Grant program, don't want to take a lot of time to talk about this, but do want everybody to know, and I think most people do know, that the Pell program is obviously the most important single program for our students and our campuses. The program has fallen into a deep shortfall mode, which has led to some complicated both political and policy discussions here in Washington. We were very pleased, as this slide points out in the third bullet, that President Trump has proposed $10.5 billion for additional funds for the Pell Grant program. If for the upcoming fiscal year, if those funds were provided under the administration's estimates, the entire shortfall would be eliminated. So that would be a great thing if we could land those monies. The exact cost of the program, it remains fluid. It always is fluid because of the nature of its benefiting over 7 million students. And the estimates, actually, estimate is a little bit over 8 million now. It's impossible so far in advance to know exactly what the participation rate is going to be. But the administration has made a very strong commitment to providing these additional funds for Pell. We're very pleased to see that. We're working with appropriators to try to make sure, as I said, that those monies end up being appropriated, while at the same time that the funding that we are advocating for in other areas, and Jim will talk about that in just a minute, is provided, because we don't want to, as important as Pell is, we don't want to see a trade-off in which the Pell program is made whole, and then we lose all these other programs that I referred to earlier that were proposed for elimination and other programs too. Just a couple final things about this Pell shortfall, because again, it's so important for our students, is that the way that the shortfall has developed is because of the changes that were made in the Simplification Act. and once that which brought a lot more students into the program and got them bigger grants, over 1 million of them. The program, once that expansion of eligibility and participation is accommodated through an increased appropriation, at least as projections have it, the program would basically be a level in terms of expenditure moving forward. It would increase slightly, but basically, if Congress is willing to secure the money that's needed to, again, accommodate the growth in the program, which Congress voted on and which President Trump signed into law the end of his first term, that the problem would largely go away. So that's very much what we're hoping happens, and advocating for. We've asked our members to reinforce that message. It's still a relevant message as the funding process moves forward, and Jim will talk to you about that again in just a minute. And then one other thing, the last bullet on this slide, just to give you some sense of what the shortfall magnitude is. Well, it's about annually right now about $12 billion, which is about a third of the overall cost of the program. So from our point of view, if that shortfall isn't funded, let's just for as a thought experiment, just think about what it would mean if those additional funds weren't provided. We'd have to cut again, well, one out of every $3 in the Pell program, and you could just imagine what that might mean on your campus. And then finally, before I turn things over to Jim, just want to talk about a little bit about the president's budget in terms of Department of Labor and NSF. Major cuts have been proposed in labor, as you can see here. It's not a new thing for a Republican administration to request deep reductions for the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. That has happened again. The program is also being proposed to be block granted and sent to states, which would include our very important dedicated program, the Strength and Community College Training Grant Program, and that proposal is not something that we're especially worried about. We've seen it before, and Congress hasn't adopted it, and that too would require Democratic agreement that we wouldn't see, even if Republicans could be unified in doing that. And then finally, and this is a matter of higher concern to us, in a way that it hasn't been previously, even though there have been there earlier were some cuts proposed previous years to the AT program, is that I'm sure many of you know that the National Science Board, which oversees the overall programming and priorities of the foundation, was dismissed in its entirety. I believe it's 3 weeks ago now. And so there's no sort of external policy guidance, which is very influential in terms of what the NSF does. There's nobody occupying those positions now. There have been a number of RIFs, reductions in force in the NSF since President Trump took office a year ago, January. And then a lot of the program people that we work with, and we have Ellen House from our team here, who's working with Courtney Larson, who manages our NSF grant and is quite expert and quite well acknowledged as a real leader in the funding of community colleges to the NSF. The people they work with, historically nonpartisan, non-political employees, a number of them are gone. So all of that amounts to the fact that we've, along with our other appropriations requests for your action, we've asked for people to make sure this year, maybe even more loudly than in recent years, that you register your support for ATE funding, and we are working inside the Beltway on that issue. We'll be reiterating our request to our presidents to make sure that they're active on this as well. We're optimistic about ATE. It's got great support. It's got great results behind it. We have been, I have been working on this program for well over 2 decades now. We've established really good support in Congress, both chambers, both parties. But given the more precarious stature right now and transition at minimum of some of the NSF personnel and leadership, um, we're um, we're going to make sure that do everything we can to ensure that there's not a negative outcome this year. And so with that, I'll turn things over to Jim to talk a little bit about what our advocacy priorities are in the funding area, along with what may happen later this year procedurally. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, David, and good afternoon or morning to all of you. Thanks for joining us. Um, uh, well, just kind of reiterating a little bit what Dave was talking about in terms of the budget proposal and the appropriations process. We are, of course, focused on all of our priority programs, many of which were on the previous slides, and as David mentioned, several of which have been proposed for elimination as they were last year by the administration. And of course, in FY26, the current fiscal year, Congress by and large rejected those proposals and provided even funding. But of course, we never take anything for granted. So again, we are calling on our members to speak with our members of Congress and contact their congressional offices, about our funding priorities. And as we generally do every year, we're focused on, with the proviso that, of course, like I said, we care and want to make noise about all our priority programs. And that's really going to differ from institution to institution in terms of which ones you're really focused on. But we also want to make sure that we're, putting something out there that's relatively um, simple and focus on a couple of things that are either just super huge priorities like the Pell Grant shortfall that David described, and also things that if Congress isn't hearing from community colleges, they're probably not hearing at all about. With that in mind, again, we're in terms of the alert that we put out earlier this year and our current funding priorities, the Pell Grant shortfall is at the top of that list in terms of Congress addressing it. There's a number of ways they can do it that are, both a combination of the appropriations process and other potential ways. We don't ask our members to get really involved in those kinds of nuances. That's up to Congress to figure out. But the bottom line message is that we want the Pell Grant shortfall addressed in full without any damaging eligibility cuts or cuts to the maximum award. So basically, we want the Congress to provide the funds that cover the costs that were incurred by as David mentioned, the FAFSA Simplification Act a couple of years ago. And then we want to see a sustaining of the institutional aid programs in whatever form that takes. And as Dave was talking about, we don't know yet exactly what that's going to look like for the current fiscal year. It's most likely going to be a kind of a supersized strengthening institution programs war, but we don't know that for sure. But we want to keep all that money in that pot, no matter how exactly it goes out. And the one program when they were considered individually that had seen cuts over the last couple of years was, in fact, the Strengthening Institutions program. So we want to try to get some of that money back this year or the next couple of years. We want to we are calling for some moderate size increases to a couple of different programs. And that is the first one is the Strengthening Community College Training Grants program. That has been funded at $65 million for the last few years. And we want to see that increase to $75 million. At these funding levels, really only about 15 or so, at least in terms of being lead grantees, colleges benefit from that program. So we got a long way to go in terms of it, making a real deep penetration into the sector. And there's a much more demand for those grants than there is supply. So we think we're well justified in seeking an increase in that program. And as David was just talking about the ATE program, that's another example of a program, a priority program for us. That has been at the same funding level for several years. That one goes even back further than SCCTG in terms of being at the same level. It's been at $75 million for those years, and we want to see an increase in that to $85 million. More than justified given the amount of time that it's spent at the same funding level over the last many years. So in terms of process and where we are, the House Appropriations Committee has announced their markup schedule, and as you can see here, the dates for our main bill, the Labor HHS Ed Appropriations, which covers most of the programs that we've been talking about, with the notable exception of the ATE program, which is in the Commerce, Justice, Science Appropriations Bill. Those are the markup dates there that you see. Those are definitely subject to change, and we wouldn't be surprised to see those dates perhaps slip a little bit as they move through the process. That definitely happened last year. And we don't know at this time what we call the 302B allocation for that bill is. They haven't, we don't even really have a top line number, in terms of discretionary programs for all the different bills, all 12 of them. So they basically just been assigning an allocation to each bill as it comes up in committee. So really, we might not know until basically that bill comes up. It's possible they'll put out the 302B allocations at some point before then, but we might not know until the bill actually comes out how much money overall has been provided for it. And then the Senate has not yet put out a schedule of its committee markups, although they have Senator Susan Collins, the chairwoman of that committee, has said that she wants to get those markups done by July 4th. So on a similar type of schedule, we'll just have to see whether that's doable over on the Senate side. They will try, as they often and usually do, to get to a place where they can do these bills in a bipartisan way in the Senate. That's going to be from what we've been hearing, that's going to be more challenging this year because in addition to the Pell Grant shortfall, there are a number of other multi-billion essentially holes that they have to make up before they really even get back to a level funding scenario. So it's a very challenging environment for the appropriations process this year, perhaps more so than is typical like I said, in large part because of the Pell Grant shortfall, but there are other things as well. And then, of course, we're not likely to see a final bill enacted until after the election, at the least, and perhaps it would spill over into next year. And that is all, a number of different factors come into play there. One of which, of course, is whether or not one or both of the houses switch party control as a result of that election. So much more to come, and you'll be hearing much more from us about appropriations as we move through the year. Okay, moving away from funding into some different areas, the first of which is reauthorization of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. We have seen some activity in this area. The House Republicans on the Education Workforce Committee introduced a new version of the Stronger Workforce for America Act. That is the same name that the bill has had in the last couple of Congresses. The main difference this time right now is that the bill, rather than being supported on a bipartisan basis, is a partisan bill. And even though, despite the fact that the bill is largely the same as the previous bipartisan version, the big issue here is the fact that this version of the bill would codify the transfer of the adult basic education program from the Department of Education to the Department of Labor. Of course, that's being sort of basically effectuated through administrative moves, as David was talking about. But this would put that into statute, and the Democrats are opposed to that. So that is why this version of the bill is not supported by the Democrats as well as the Republicans. So for that reason, as we've already seen the committee approve that bill on a partisan basis, party line vote in the committee. We may or may not see that bill go to the House floor. If we do, it'll probably be later this year. There's probably not a very large chance of that. And of course, this version of the bill doesn't really have any future prospects in the Senate. So this may be the end of the road where we are now in terms of that reauthorization for this Congress. And then workforce Pell status. We've covered a lot of this ground certainly in previous webinars, but just to reiterate that, we have an administration that's strongly committed to the program, both in terms of moving the regulations along, as well as providing resources through various grant competitions, SCCTG and FIPSI. They're still on track as far as we know to having things in place for a July 1st kickoff. Of course, the next big thing that needs to happen is an issuance of the final rule. And just a few weeks ago we had on April 8th was when the comments closed for the NPRM. So they're busy right now at the Department of Education reading all the comments that were submitted in that NPRM and putting that final rule into place. And then we've had discussions with many of you in terms of what's happening in your states, and I think just generally speaking, we think that a lot of states will be kind of very moving into this area somewhat tentatively, and identifying a few programs as pilots for that initial part of the year or a year or so. And we also know that a lot of states are very actively engaged and holding a lot of meetings at every level. But we also know that that's not happening at all in some other states, including some of the larger states. So much more to come there as well. And then the NPRM that I just mentioned that came out, and we AACC commented along with a number of you on that closed on April 8th. We focused our comments mostly on areas where we felt that the department strayed some from the statutory authority, and in doing so, introduced some more friction into a process that already has a lot of barriers and a lot of hurdles that institutions and states must overcome in order to make programs eligible. And you can see some of that, they added an in-occupation element to the job placement rate that takes effect after a couple of years. They base job placement on exiters in those first few years. The 12-month clock, from our perspective, is too arduous and requires programs to meet all the requirements for 12 months before becoming eligible, rather than simply having been offered for 12 months. And then a couple of other things in terms of agreements between states and who gets counted in the job placement and value-added earnings calculations. So, we'll just have to see whether the department makes any changes to the regulations based on any of those comments or other people's comments. So we expect to see that final rule, obviously sometime between now and July 1st, but hopefully, as much before July 1st as possible. And so I'm going to turn it back over to David, who's going to get into the latest negotiated rulemaking topic, accreditation.
Thank you, Jim. And I saw that we just had a question posed in the Q&A section of the Zoom session. And please feel free to put questions in there. And also, we'll take live questions at the conclusion of our presentation, which we'll try not to make too long. I'm going to talk about a couple regulatory issues, and then Catherine will talk about some issues in the area of student aid. But we should have a good amount of time left for any questions or comments that you might have. We always remain interested in knowing what's going on in terms of campus interaction with the federal programs. Among other things, right now we are curious to hear about any challenges that colleges may be facing in terms of the movement of programs out of the Department of Education over to the Department of Labor and other agencies. But as Jim just said, the accreditation negotiated rulemaking is an ongoing process, and it's a complicated set of regulations because, as I'm sure almost all of you, if not all of you, know, the way that the federal government impacts the accreditation process is through its leverage through the Title IV programs. And if an accreditor wants to serve as a gatekeeper for Title IV, which accreditors want to do, generally speaking, they have to meet the requirements that are first written into the Higher Education Act, but second, then implemented by the Department of Education, interpreted, refined, and made a little bit more prescriptive and precise than what's in the statute. And so, in a context of the administration making a lot of criticisms about higher education, which are certainly not unique to this administration, the administration has proposed a variety of changes to the standards by which accrediting agencies would be recognized by the department. in these regulations. Before I talk about some of the big changes that are on the table and being advanced by the department in this negotiated rulemaking process, just a little bit about the process itself. First of all, it's a 2 week set of negotiations in total. The first set of negotiations was in the middle of April for a week, and then there will be a final round of negotiations that start May 18th, May 17th. Any rate, in a couple weeks, they will start up again. Monty Sullivan is the former president of the Louisiana Community Technical College system, and so somebody who we know well and work with well is at the table. As this slide points out, and as we've mentioned in other neg regs, the department has collapsed the public 2 and 4 year institutions as far as negotiations go, which we have objected to formally to no avail. So fortunately for us, our representative is at the table. In the first week of negotiations, just prior to them, the department had put forward a set of major changes to the accreditation regulations. Those were negotiated and argued over, discussed for a week. Some changes were made. Revised set of regulatory draft regulations were provided towards the end of that first week of negotiation. And then negotiators were encouraged to provide additional proposals. And then a second set of revisions are planned to be made available at early next week. And then we expected them to be out already, which is what this slide says, and I apologize for that, but don't want people to be misled. The slides we'll send you after this will have that correction on them. So no, we don't have a new set of regulations, but we expect it early next week. And I'm not going to spend time to repeat the criticisms that have been made about institutional higher education, which you've read about in the press, and many of those have been reflected both by Department of Education personnel and their lead negotiator, as well as some of the other negotiators on the panel. More specifically, some of the major changes that the department is advancing are, and I think the first two are probably the most significant for our institutions. One is that in the current first accreditation standards, which are standards of student achievement, and there are 10 standards overall, this first standard is being refined and made more prescriptive by the administration. First of all, they're saying that the creditors have to look at individual programs and program data, not just the institution as a whole. So that is a new requirement. There's also some requirements related to creditors having to look at student learning in a new way. Of course, everybody wants students to learn, but the way that the student learning would have to be documented and reported by creditors is new and potentially problematic for both institutions and accreditors. And I neglected to point out on the previous slide is that we wrote a piece on our CC Daily that was published on Monday, or in our blast on this past Monday, that goes into these issues in greater detail. And I'm happy to speak with anybody individually about their thoughts and concerns about this. So the second bullet here is a landmark change if it's adopted, and that is that it would require creditors to put into place a policy whereby institutions would be required to accept credits from incoming transfer students for their general education programs, non-majors, but for Gen Ed, those credits would all have to transfer absent an explicit documentation and rationale on the part of the receiving institution about why those credits were not acceptable. And so it might be student performance, it might be something about, for example, the syllabus of a program at the sending quote unquote institution. But the default method for colleges would be to accept the all the credits of incoming students. All community college um, people know that that is a major change. It would, in many respects, be an extraordinary benefit to our students. Obviously, it would be complicated to administer on the other end, perhaps, in which transfer students were coming in, which, of course, they do in large numbers to our institutions. But this has been immensely controversial because particularly the four-year institutions are arguing that they need to have much more discretion over which credits they accept and don't accept, and that this is an overreach on the part of the federal government. Couple other things that are on this slide that I will just point out is that the language as proposed would require institutions to engage in cost-benefit analysis as they were making new expenditures on a variety of campus activities, and how you go about documenting the cost versus the benefits of something like student services or even a new facility is subject to some question. And then kind of wading into the culture wars, if you will, and some of the flashpoints on campuses, four-year institutions more than our institutions, but is the getting accreditors involved in the administration or compliance with the First Amendment, which of course, First Amendment and our colleges as public institutions are required to provide First Amendment protections to students. And so, from our point of view and other negotiators' point of view, this is a redundant requirement. It arguably gets accreditors involved in an area where they don't need to be involved, arguably don't have as much expertise as the institutions themselves do. And of course, again, they're subject to the First Amendment as a function of being public organizations. So we just assume the department not be involved in that. And then also, without it being able for me to go into any real detail in terms of academic freedom, there are some new standards, it's not technically the right word, but some new conditions that accreditors would need to apply to the protection of academic freedom on campus. And that's also a new area of activity for institutions. Um, maybe to just close this discussion, again, I refer to the article that was run on Monday in our CC Daily, is to say that despite all the criticism of accreditations being cumbersome and expensive and whatnot, these regulations would, in all likelihood, we would assert, would actually add to the expense of the accreditation process. The administration is very committed to creating more competition between accreditors and opening up accreditation to other agencies. These regulations also would clearly do that. So it would not just be, an overlay of more requirements, but again, bring, in all likelihood, more accreditors into the system. But it would also have these other burdens applied to accreditors. So to be continued, we'll be doing another webinar. It's on June 10th. We'll close with that, but we are doing another webinar on June 10th, and we will at that time give you a wrap up of how the second week of negotiated rulemaking on accreditation goes, whether there's agreement, and what exactly the regulations say. We're getting on in time here, so I don't want to go into a lot of detail on this next slide. It is a pending regulation. It's a implementation of law, the part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that was passed, of course, last July. The major item of interest to community colleges is a new earning standard whereby programs, in order to remain eligible for federal direct loans, would have to have their graduates, the median earnings of their graduates exceed the average high school earnings of individuals in the state age 25 to 34, those who only have a high school degree. And this is also being applied to certificate programs as well, even though the law passed last July only applied to degree programs. And there's some other things in there that I'm not going to take time this afternoon to go into. Again, we're happy to answer questions you might have offline. We will be submitting comments on these regulations in a couple of weeks, and we'll be going on in some detail on that to the department. So with that, let me turn things over to Catherine to talk about that the ever welcome process of verification and our very real efforts to try to crack down on phantom ghost students. Catherine?
Yeah, so this is a bit of an update from earlier webinars where we've covered the new Department of Education real-time identity verification proposal that they were rolling out. That has officially gone live as of April 26th. We've been having regular check-ins with the FAFSA team over at the Department of Education. We've also been talking to a number of financial aid officers at our colleges across the country. And I would say the mood is that folks are cautiously optimistic that this is going to be helpful in stemming the tide of ghost student applications who are attempting to access Title IV funds. But we are still very much in that stage where they're doing a lot of testing, a lot of iterating, and where our cooperation and our sharing of how this is rolling out on our campuses is going to be really important for further refining the algorithm that they are using. So again, this is a little bit of review, but unlike in the previous world where you would have an ISER, an institutional student information record transmitted to a college that would later be flagged as potentially fraudulent, and then the college would have to run an identity verification. Instead, the college will now receive an ISER that has been rejected as associated with fraud, and then the college can then choose to run a verification if that student presents themselves in person. So it's taking a little bit of the burden off of colleges from having to do that initial verification. A lot of this is going to depend as far as success on how many students, legitimate students, are getting flagged as fraudulent and seeing their ISERs rejected. Ed has every hope that it's going to be very, very, very few students who present themselves in person as part of this process. So that's why they are saying that this is going to take a lot of the burden off of institutions. But it's really important that you communicate both to the department and then also to us as your representatives here in DC if you are seeing students who are getting legitimate students who are getting caught in this process so that they can take that back and further refine that algorithm. Again, they're anticipating that's going to be very, very, very few students based on that 0.4% false positive rate when they were testing that screening algorithm over the summer and fall. What we don't know, and what we continue to emphasize with our members and with the department, is we don't know what the false negative rate is. So we don't quite know, because it's impossible to know, how many fraudulent students or fraudulent applicants, that is, are making it through this screening procedure until it gets later into the disbursement cycle, and colleges may be seeing them or flagging them with their own software or flagging them through individual experiences with that applicant on a campus level. That information is also going to be critically important to communicate back to Ed. So if you are using your own identity screening software and seeing Title IV applicants who are being flagged as fraudulent on your campus who have made it through this new system, please communicate that both to the department and to us. Again, we have every hope that this is going to be really helpful in cutting back the number of R2T4s that our institutions are having to run on ghost students, but a lot of it is going to require our cooperation at this early stage. And we'll certainly have more updates on this in future webinars as well. A couple other student aid issues over on the congressional side. There's been a lot of attention paid to this issue. The president has been focused on fraud in public programs, and that has been taken up by House Republicans in particular. So they have introduced some legislation around ghost student issues that are really sort of codifying what the department is already doing. This first bill, the No Aid for Ghost Students Act, is exactly that. It just codifies this new real-time identity screening. The second bill they've introduced that but all of these have been advanced by the committee and will likely be taken up on the floor. The second just says essentially that if you're not doing your due diligence as an institution to run V4, V5s on ICERs that have been rejected, you'll be prioritized for program review. We don't expect many of our colleges to get caught up in that because we're good stewards of Title IV dollars, and we're going to run a V4, V5 if we get a rejected ICER. But that's another bill that has been advanced by the committee. And then this last one is the only one that was partisan. It would require new citizenship flags for FAFSA contributors as part of identity verification. This is, we'll see how it does on the House floor, but it's pretty much dead on arrival in the Senate because of some concerns that is information that could lead to a chilling effect in applicants from mixed status households. But again, these are three bills that we're watching that are related to identity verification. There's some emphasis, a significant amount of emphasis right now in both the House and the Senate around college cost transparency. And we're likely to see some further movement in this area. I think this has been percolating for a long time. There's been a lot of bipartisan interest in improving financial aid offers, improving net price calculators, and improving loan counseling. We did want to flag as an update for how this issue is being dealt with on the Hill that we have endorsed the Senate Help Committee Republicans bill on financial aid offers. It's called the Improving Financial Aid Offers for Students Act. That's being sponsored by Help Committee Chair Bill Cassidy and also by Senator Chuck Grassley, who's really been a leader in the cost transparency space. They worked really, really closely with community colleges to craft this legislation that we really do think will present information on costs more effectively to our students while maintaining flexibility to ensure that we're able to ensure that the information being presented is tailored to students, to programs, and to the institution itself. So we're really excited about our working relationship that has led to the introduction of that bill. Next slide. And then the last legislative issue we just wanted to mention is the Farm Bill. This is something we've been working on for a little while since the last Farm Bill expired in 2023. We had a number of priorities around the Farm Bill, some related to the research titles, some related to the nutrition titles. A lot of the nutrition title issues, including the SNAP program, were dealt with in the One Big Beautiful Bill Reconciliation Act, but a lot of the other research and agricultural production programs were not eligible for reconciliation, so they were not able to be addressed in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So that is what the agriculture committees in the House and the Senate are taking up now. They're taking up the titles that are kind of left over and doing a skinny reauthorization of the Farm Bill. A quick update here is that the House did pass their proposal, which is called the Food, Farm, and National Security Act, and it did include a new authorization for a program for community college agriculture and natural resources programs. That's been something we've been pushing for now, I guess 2 years, 3 years now, to be included in an eventual Farm Bill. This one's a little bit different than our preferred proposal, which was the Bipartisan Community College Agriculture Advancement Act. That focused really heavily on capacity building, so authorizing new grants for capacity building. The one that was ultimately included in the House proposal is a little bit less emphasis on capacity, but still a strong indication of support for community college workforce training programs for agriculture, and an emphasis on work-based learning. This is an area where we're just excited to see any new support and new opportunities for our community college agriculture programs at USDA, and we're going to be lobbying the Senate to ensure that this is included in whatever final proposal is signed into law. And then lastly, we did want to flag that registration is now open for our annual Advocates in Action event here in Washington, D.C. It's going to occur on September 15th and 16th. We're putting together the program as we speak, and we're really excited to see many of you here in DC. I think David will probably take the opportunity to talk a little bit about it when I hand the mic back to him. But this is a great event. We always get really positive reviews. It's more seminar style, but it gives you a real up-close opportunity to talk to a lot of the people who are influencing higher education policy here in DC. And we hope to see many of you there. Thanks.
So get out your phones and scan that QR code and register right now. We do have some time for questions and answers. If you haven't posed a question yet, you can still do so through the Q&A box on your screen. We've got a couple in the hopper right now. And the first one is in regard to the workforce Pell proposed regulations. And the question is, how likely are we to prevail on the 12-month eligibility rule? And just to kind of reiterate what I said a few minutes ago, the issue there is that under the proposed regulations, a program must have been not only offered, but it has to have met all the workforce Pell metrics for 12 months before it can be approved as a workforce Pell program. So we think that this is overreach of what the statute says, which simply says the program needs to have been offered for 12 months. And that is what we are pushing for the final regulations to say, that the program has to have been offered for 12 months and that it currently, at the time of approval, meets the requirements. David, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add. Now, in terms of our likelihood to prevail, it's always very hard to say in terms of that. Obviously, the proposed regulations reflect what the Department of Education thinks the regulations should say. So they're largely in the driver's seat. But we'll have to see. But at the same time, they are also very strong proponents of workforce Pell and want to see it work. So maybe if there are things that they hadn't thought through enough and it's pointed out to them in the comments, that might lead to some changes. But it's hard to say. David, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add. I see that.
Not really. We encourage everybody to weigh in on this because this is not the plain sense reading of the statute, as Jim was describing the department's proposed rule in this area. But this was raised in negotiations a number of times, and they didn't budge on it. So it's hard to be wildly optimistic about it, but there's some chance that this might be there might be some changes there. I mean, Jim's point is certainly true in that the department very much wants this program to succeed and has shown that in a variety of ways.
And the next question is about Perkins funding and specifically the proposals for it in the administration's budget proposal. And the question is, will Perkins funding only be secondary CTE for secondary CTE? And does that mean community colleges would be excluded? Dave, I don't know if you want to field that.
Well, as Jim knows as well, this is only a proposal, not anything that's been enacted. As I tried to describe, this was proposed last year as well by President Trump, and Congress didn't pick it up, and our expectation is they won't pick it up this year either. But if the proposal were to be accepted by Congress, yeah, I mean, we would be cut out of those dollars, and we would be really, really unhappy, obviously. But the hope is that, an expectation is that Congress isn't going to agree to that.
Yeah, totally agree. And but not to say that in terms of your communications with your members of Congress, obviously it's something of that's worth burning up and saying that you would oppose such a change for sure. Next question is about TRIO. Our colleges in the first year of a new TRIO grant, how will it be impacted by the new round of TRIO applications?
Shouldn't be impacted by it. I mean, you've received the grant, with given terms and conditions. The administration, as this question implies, changed some of the criteria for a couple of the currently pending applications, which caused a lot of anxiety and resistance from the TRIO community, and a lot of it from our institutions as part of that. But if you've already received the grant, it's unlikely to be altered as a result of the administration's changing policies in this area.
And then the final question is the perennial one. How are we gonna? We will be sharing the slide deck with everyone. You'll get a. We're gonna be posting it as well as a recording, and then we will have links to that in the follow-up email for you all, as well as a link to register for our next webinar, which will be on Wednesday, June 10th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern time. So look for that registration link in addition to the materials from this webinar. And that is all the questions that we have in the queue.
So with that, since Jim and Catherine both made plugs for Advocates in Action, I'll just close this by saying we really hope that you can make the time and identify the resources to come down for our 2-day meeting in September. A number of you on the call have attended in the past, and it gets, as Catherine mentioned, phenomenal evaluations. We've already lined up a couple of speakers. Because it's election year, we're going to tilt a slight bit to that side of what we do and have some people who are pollsters and political analysts with us, as well as people who are involved directly in an ongoing way on higher education policy. So we think it's going to be a great meeting. It's always a joy for us to present to our members high-level people from DC in various positions. So we hope you can make it. Not to play hard to get, but it's true that we did run out of registration slots last year, and we had to turn some people away, which was really disappointing on our part. We've expanded our capacity a little bit, but we do try to keep the meeting relatively small to give attendees a chance to get kind of up close and personal and speak to the presenters if they want to. So I do encourage you to register for that as soon as possible. And with that, we will give you back a couple minutes for this hour, and I look forward to seeing you on June 10th. And everybody be safe. And again, thanks for your involvement.